What if I told you that the most unbreakable code in military history was not created by mathematicians at prestigious universities or cryptographers in secret government laboratories? What if I told you that the code which saved thousands of American lives and helped win the bloodiest war in human history was actually an ancient language that the United States government had spent 50 years trying to destroy? Tonight, we uncover the true story of America's code talkers, not the sanitized version you read in history books. The real story, the one filled with betrayal, sacrifice, secrets that were buried for decades, and heroes who were forbidden from telling their own families what they had done. Before we begin, I need something from you. Drop a comment right now telling me where you are watching from, your city, your country, and if you believe that these forgotten warriors deserve to have their stories told, please subscribe to this channel. We cannot keep bringing you this hidden history without your support. Hit that button. Help us honor the men who honored us all. The year was 1942. The place, a windowless room deep within the Navy Department building in Washington, District of Columbia. Inside, a group of military officers sat around a table covered with documents stamped in red ink. Top secret. Eyes only. Burn after reading. At the head of the table sat a man named Philip Johnston. He was not a military officer. He was not a government official. He was the son of a Protestant missionary who had grown up on the Navajo reservation in Arizona, and he had come to Washington with an idea that would change the course of the war. "Gentlemen," Johnston said, his voice steady despite the skepticism he saw in their eyes, "I understand that our codes are being broken. I understand that Japanese intelligence has cracked every cipher we have developed. I understand that American soldiers are dying because the enemy knows our plans before we execute them." The officers shifted uncomfortably. What Johnston said was true, but it was also classified information that a civilian should not possess. Johnston continued, "I am here to offer you a solution, a code that cannot be broken, a code that the Japanese will never decipher, no matter how many linguists they employ or how many captured documents they analyze, a code based on the Navajo language." One of the officers, a rear admiral named Clayton Vogel, leaned forward. "Explain." And so Johnston explained. He explained that the Navajo language was one of the most complex linguistic systems on Earth. He explained that it had no written form, meaning there were no textbooks or dictionaries that an enemy could study. He explained that its syntax, tonal qualities, and grammatical structure were so radically different from European and Asian languages that even trained linguists required years of immersion to achieve basic fluency. But most importantly, he explained something that made the officers exchange glances of dawning comprehension. There are fewer than 30 non-Navajo people in the entire world who speak this language fluently, Johnston said. None of them are Japanese. None of them are German. The Navajo language is, for all practical purposes, an unbreakable code that already exists. All we need to do is use it. What Johnston did not explain, what he carefully avoided mentioning, was the bitter irony of his proposal. Just decades earlier, the United States government had operated boarding schools designed specifically to eradicate Native American languages. Navajo children had been beaten for speaking their mother tongue. They had been forced to wash their mouths with soap. They had been told that their language was primitive, savage, worthless. Now that same government needed that language to survive. The Navajo Code Talker program was approved within weeks. By May of 1942, the first 29 Navajo recruits had arrived at Camp Elliott in California. They were about to become the most valuable communications assets in the United States military. They were also about to enter a world of secrecy so complete that many of them would carry its weight for the rest of their lives. The first story we must tell tonight concerns a man whose name was Chester Yellowhorse. He was 19 years old when he arrived at Camp Elliott, a quiet young man from a small community near Shiprock, New Mexico. He had never seen the ocean. He had never been more than 50 miles from the place where he was born. He had never imagined that his grandmother's language would make him one of the most important soldiers in the Pacific War. Chester's training began with a challenge that seemed impossible. The Navajo language had no words for modern military concepts. There was no Navajo word for submarine or tank or machine gun. There was no word for battalion or amphibious assault or air support. The code talkers had to create an entirely new vocabulary from scratch. They worked in a secured building surrounded by armed guards. They were forbidden from taking notes home. They were forbidden from discussing their work with anyone, including each other, outside of designated areas. They were told that if they were captured by the enemy, they would be tortured for information they could never reveal. Chester later described those early days in a rare interview conducted in 1989, more than 40 years after the war ended. "We sat in that room for hours every day," he said, trying to find Navajo words that could represent military terms. "We had to be creative. We had to think like our ancestors, who named everything in the natural world according to its characteristics. A submarine became besh lo, which means ironfish. A tank became che dagahi, which means tortoise. A bomber became jay-sho, which means buzzard. A fighter plane became dahe-tihi, which means hummingbird, because of how fast and agile it was. But it was not enough to simply create new words. The code talkers also developed a system for spelling out words that had no Navajo equivalent, using a complex alphabet where each English letter was represented by a Navajo word. The letter A, for example, could be Wallachi, which means ant, or Belasana, which means apple, or Tisinil, which means axe. This variation made the code even more difficult to crack, because the same English letter could be transmitted in multiple different ways. By the end of their training, the first 29 code talkers had memorized over 200 military terms and a complete spelling alphabet. They could transmit complex tactical messages in seconds that would have taken hours to encode and decode using conventional methods. But their real test was yet to come. Chester Yellow Horse was deployed to the Pacific in August of 1942. His first combat assignment was on the island of Guadalcanal, where American forces were engaged in a brutal campaign to establish a foothold in Japanese-controlled territory. What Chester witnessed on Guadalcanal would haunt him for the rest of his life. The fighting was close and savage. Japanese soldiers attacked in waves, often at night, screaming battle cries that echoed through the jungle. The Americans fought back with everything they had, but they were outnumbered and undersupplied. Disease claimed nearly as many lives as enemy bullets. Men who survived the combat often succumbed to malaria, dysentery, or infections that turned minor wounds into death sentences. Chester's job was to transmit coordinates, troop movements, and tactical orders between command posts. He worked in a communications bunker that was targeted repeatedly by Japanese artillery. He spoke into a radio while shells exploded around him, his voice never wavering, his words never faltering. The Japanese intercepted every transmission he made. They recorded them. They analyzed them. They brought in their best linguists, men who spoke dozens of languages, men who had broken codes that were considered unbreakable. They understood nothing. To Japanese intelligence, the Navajo transmissions sounded like nonsense. Strange sounds that followed no recognizable pattern. Words that appeared in no dictionary. A language so alien that they could not even determine its basic structure. One Japanese officer, captured after the war, described his experience trying to decipher the Navajo code. "We thought at first it was a sophisticated encryption system," he said. "We assumed the Americans had developed some new technology we did not understand. We spent months trying to find the pattern, the key that would unlock the code. Then we captured an American radio and heard the transmissions ourselves. That was when we realized it was not a code at all. It was a language, but a language unlike anything we had ever encountered. It did not sound like any European language. It did not sound like any Asian language. It sounded like something from another world entirely. We never broke it. We never came close. Chester Yellowhorse survived Guadalcanal. He went on to serve in some of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War: Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. At each of these places, the Navajo code talkers played a crucial role in coordinating American operations. But the story of Chester Yellowhorse is not simply a story of military success. It is also a story of personal sacrifice that few people understood. When Chester returned home to the Navajo reservation after the war, he was forbidden from telling anyone what he had done. The Code Talker program remained classified for over 2 decades. Chester could not explain to his family why he sometimes woke screaming in the night. He could not explain to his children why certain sounds made him flinch. He could not explain to anyone the burden he carried. In his 1989 interview, Chester described this silence. "People asked me what I did in the war," he said. "I had to lie. I told them I was a regular radio man. I told them I had a boring job behind the lines. I could not tell them the truth. My own father died thinking I had contributed nothing special to the war effort. He was proud that I served, but he never knew what I really did. I could not give him that pride. The government would not let me." Chester's voice broke as he continued. "Do you know what it is like to carry a secret that defines your entire life? To have done something that mattered, something that saved lives, something that helped win the war, and not be able to tell anyone? I was not looking for medals. I was not looking for recognition. I just wanted my family to know. I wanted my father to know before he died that his son had done something important. But he never knew, and I had to live with that." Chester Yellowhorse died in 2003 at the age of 80. By then, the Code Talker program had finally been declassified, and he had received the Congressional Gold Medal along with his fellow veterans. But for Chester, the recognition came too late. Everyone he had wanted to tell was already gone. The second story we must tell tonight concerns a code talker, whose experience reveals a darker aspect of the program. His name was Samuel Begay, and what happened to him demonstrates the impossible position these men were placed in. Samuel was 21 years old when he was recruited for the Code Talker program in 1943. He was assigned to the 4th Marine Division and deployed to the Marshall Islands in early 1944. Unlike Chester Yellowhorse, Samuel was not assigned to a communications bunker. He was attached to a frontline infantry unit as a field communicator. His job was to accompany assault troops into combat, carrying a radio on his back, transmitting and receiving orders while bullets flew around him. This was dangerous enough. But Samuel faced an additional danger that few people outside the program knew about. The Navajo Code Talkers were considered so valuable that each one was assigned a personal bodyguard. This bodyguard had 2 responsibilities. The first was to protect the Code Talker from enemy fire. The second was far more disturbing. If capture by the Japanese became imminent, the bodyguard was under orders to kill the Code Talker before he could be taken alive. The military reasoning was coldly logical. A captured Code Talker could be tortured into revealing the code. Even if he resisted, the Japanese might be able to extract linguistic information through prolonged interrogation. The code's security depended on the enemy having no access to Navajo speakers. If that meant sacrificing the Code Talkers themselves, so be it. Samuel learned of this policy during a briefing shortly before his first combat deployment. He later described his reaction. "They told us like it was nothing," he said. "Like they were explaining a piece of equipment. If you are about to be captured, your bodyguard will shoot you. It is for the good of the mission." I looked at the Marine who had been assigned to protect me. His name was Corporal William Hendricks, from Ohio. He was a good man. I could see in his eyes that he did not want this responsibility, but he would do it if he had to. That was the kind of soldier he was. I shook his hand. I told him I understood. I told him that if the time came, he should not hesitate. But inside, I was thinking about my mother. I was thinking about how she would receive the news that her son was shot by his own people. How would they explain that? Would they even try? Samuel served with distinction throughout the Pacific Campaign. He transmitted critical messages during the invasions of Kwajalein, Saipan, Tinian, and Iwo Jima. He was wounded twice. He watched friends die. He carried the weight of his secret assignment, while knowing that the man walking beside him might one day become his executioner. The moment Samuel feared finally came on the island of Iwo Jima in February of 1945. His unit was advancing toward Mount Suribachi when they were ambushed by a Japanese force that had been hiding in a network of tunnels. Within minutes, Samuel's squad was pinned down in a crater, surrounded on 3 sides by enemy fire. One by one, the Marines around him fell. Some were killed instantly. Others lay wounded, crying for help that could not come. Samuel continued transmitting, calling in coordinates for artillery support, his voice steady even as death closed in around him. Then, Corporal Hendricks was hit. The bullet struck him in the chest. He fell backward, gasping for air, his eyes wide with shock. Samuel crawled to his side, pressing his hands against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. Hendricks grabbed Samuel's arm. His grip was weak, fading. "The code," Hendricks whispered. "Protect the code." And then Samuel understood. Hendricks was not asking Samuel to protect the code. He was reminding Samuel of his duty. If Samuel was about to be captured, he would have to take his own life. His bodyguard could no longer do it for him. Samuel looked at his pistol. He looked at the Japanese soldiers advancing through the smoke. He looked at the radio on his back, the device that made him so valuable and so vulnerable. He made a decision. Samuel picked up his rifle and charged directly at the nearest Japanese position. He was not trying to escape. He was not trying to fight his way out. He was trying to die in a way that would protect the code while giving him a soldier's death, rather than suicide or execution. What happened next, Samuel could never fully explain. The Japanese soldiers did not shoot him. Some of them turned to face his charge, but their weapons seemed to malfunction or miss. Samuel reached their position and engaged in hand-to-hand combat, fighting with a ferocity he did not know he possessed. Within minutes, American reinforcements arrived. The Japanese withdrew. Samuel was pulled to safety, covered in blood that was mostly not his own. When medics examined him later, they found only minor injuries. He had charged a fortified position alone, killed 4 enemy soldiers in close combat, and emerged almost unscathed. Samuel never believed it was skill or luck that saved him. He believed it was something else. "My grandmother used to tell me that our ancestors watch over us," he said. "She said that when we face death with courage, they come to protect us. I do not know if that is true, but I know that I should have died on that mountain. I know that there is no logical explanation for why I survived. Maybe my grandmother was right. Maybe the old ones were there with me. Maybe they were not ready to let me go." Samuel Bigay returned from the war a changed man. Like Chester Yellowhorse, he was forbidden from discussing his service. Unlike Chester, Samuel struggled with what he called the weight of almost dying. He experienced what would later be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. He had nightmares about Corporal Hendricks. He had flashbacks to the moment when he decided to charge. He had panic attacks triggered by sounds that reminded him of combat, but he could not seek help. He could not explain to doctors what had happened to him. He could not tell counselors about the policy that had made him a target for his own side. The secrecy that protected the code also trapped Samuel in a prison of silence. He turned to alcohol. He lost his job. He lost his family. For years, he lived on the margins of reservation society, a broken man carrying secrets he could not share. It was not until 1968, when the Code Talker program was finally declassified, that Samuel began to heal. For the first time, he could talk about what he had experienced. For the first time, he could seek treatment from doctors who understood his trauma. For the first time, he could explain to his children why their father was the way he was. Samuel died in 1992. His funeral was attended by Marines from across the country, including several who had served with him on Iwo Jima. The eulogy was given by a grandson who had joined the Marines himself, inspired by a grandfather whose heroism he had only learned about as a teenager. He carried two burdens, the grandson said, the burden of war and the burden of silence. I do not know which was heavier, but I know he carried them both with more courage than most men ever have to show. The third story we must tell tonight concerns not a single code talker, but a group of men whose collective experience reveals the spiritual dimension of their service. In November of 1943, a contingent of 12 Navajo code talkers was preparing for deployment to the Pacific. Before they left, they gathered for a ceremony that the Marine Corps knew nothing about. The ceremony was conducted by a medicine man named Hosteen Yazi, who had traveled 300 miles from the reservation to be with the young warriors. What happened during that ceremony was described by one of the participants, a code talker named Albert Nez, in an oral history recorded in 1997. The old man came to us the night before we shipped out, Albert said. He brought sacred items that had been passed down through generations, corn pollen, eagle feathers, a bundle of herbs that smelled like the desert after rain. He told us that we were going to face evil, not just human enemies, but something darker. He said that war releases spirits, both good and bad, and that we would need protection against forces that bullets could not stop. He performed a ceremony that lasted until dawn. He sang songs in the old language, songs that our grandmothers had sung, songs that connected us to the earth and the sky and the holy people who watch over our tribe. When the ceremony was finished, he gave each of us a small pouch to wear around our necks. He told us never to remove it. He told us that as long as we carried it, we would be protected. All 12 of those code talkers went to war. All 12 of them served in some of the most dangerous battles of the Pacific Campaign. All 12 of them were wounded at least once. All 12 of them survived. This fact has been cited by some as evidence of supernatural protection. Others attribute it to coincidence or to the natural caution that spiritual belief might inspire. What cannot be disputed is the psychological comfort that the ceremony provided. Albert Nez described this comfort in vivid terms. There were nights in the jungle when I could feel something watching us, he said. Not Japanese soldiers. Something else. Something hungry. Something that fed on fear and death. When I felt that presence, I would touch the pouch around my neck. I would whisper the prayers the medicine man had taught me, and the presence would fade. It would move on, looking for easier prey. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe the pouch was just a piece of leather filled with dried plants. But when you are lying in a foxhole, surrounded by death, with shells exploding all around you, imagination becomes reality. What you believe becomes what saves you. I believed I was protected, and that belief kept me sane when sanity seemed impossible. After the war, several of the 12 code talkers from that ceremony became medicine men themselves. They felt called to continue the spiritual traditions that had sustained them during their darkest hours. They conducted ceremonies for other veterans, helping them find peace with the horrors they had witnessed. One of them, a man named Joseph Curley, developed a specific healing ritual for combat trauma. He called it the Enemy Way Ceremony, adapting an ancient Navajo practice for the needs of modern warriors. The ceremony lasted several days and involved the entire community. The veteran would recount his experiences, while family members and friends provided support. Sacred songs would be sung. Symbolic actions would be performed to cleanse the warrior of the spiritual contamination of killing. Joseph explained the philosophy behind the ceremony in an interview from 2001. In our tradition, taking a life creates an imbalance, he said. Even when the killing is justified, even when it is necessary, it leaves a mark on the soul. The enemy's spirit becomes attached to you. It follows you home. It whispers in your ear at night. The enemy way ceremony is designed to break that attachment. It acknowledges what the warrior has done. It honors the sacrifice, but it also releases the warrior from the burden. It tells the enemy spirits that the fight is over. It sends them on their way. White people have a hard time understanding this. They think we are talking about superstition. But I have seen what happens to veterans who do not receive healing. I have seen men destroyed by guilt they cannot name. I have seen families torn apart by violence that follows warriors home from war. The ceremony works. I do not care if scientists can explain it. I only care that it helps people who are suffering. Joseph Curley conducted enemy way ceremonies for veterans of World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf War. He continued his healing work until his death in 2014 at the age of 92. At his funeral, a Marine general who had served in Vietnam gave testimony about how Joseph's ceremony had saved his life. "I was ready to end it all," the general said, 20 years after the war, and I was still fighting it every night in my dreams. Medication did not help. Therapy did not help. Nothing helped. Then someone told me about Joseph. I flew to Arizona. I participated in the ceremony, and something changed. I cannot explain it. I do not need to explain it. I just know that I walked into that ceremony as a dead man, and I walked out as someone who wanted to live again. The fourth story we must tell tonight concerns a code talker whose experience after the war reveals the complex relationship between Native American veterans and the country they served. His name was Teddy Draper, and he was one of the original 29 code talkers who developed the Unbreakable Code in 1942. He served with distinction throughout the war, participating in 6 major amphibious assaults. He was awarded the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and numerous other commendations. When Teddy returned to the Navajo Reservation in 1945, he expected to be treated as a hero. He expected that his service would earn him the respect and recognition that any veteran deserved. He was wrong. The Navajo Reservation in 1945 was a place of desperate poverty. The government had neglected its treaty obligations for decades. There were no jobs. There was limited health care. Children went hungry while bureaucrats in Washington debated policy. Teddy, despite his military service, despite his medals, despite the skills he had developed during the war, could find no work. The Bureau of Indian Affairs offered him nothing. The Veterans Administration provided minimal support. The same government that had relied on his language to win the war now seemed to have forgotten he existed. Worse, Teddy could not even explain what he had done. The Code Talker program remained classified. When he applied for jobs, he could not cite his specialized training. When he sought recognition, he could not describe his accomplishments. He was just another Indian veteran in a country that did not know how to treat its native warriors. Teddy's frustration was compounded by a bitter irony. The language that had saved American lives was still being suppressed on the reservation. Children were still being punished for speaking Navajo in school. The boarding school system that had tried to erase native culture was still operating. In a letter to his cousin, written in 1947, Teddy expressed his confusion and anger. "I do not understand this country," he wrote. "They took our land. They killed our people. They tried to destroy our language. Then, when they needed that language to fight their war, they came to us for help. We gave them help. We saved their soldiers. We helped them win. And now? Now they treat us the same as before. Worse, maybe, because now we know what we are worth. We know that our language, the language they tried to beat out of us, was worth more than all their fancy codes and machines. How am I supposed to feel? Proud that I served? Angry that my service means nothing? Both. I fought for a country that does not fight for me. I protected people who do not protect my people. I kept secrets that I cannot tell, for a government that keeps no promises to us. Teddy Draper spent the next 2 decades advocating for Native American rights. He testified before Congress. He organized protests. He wrote letters to newspapers and politicians. He demanded that the government honor its treaties, provide adequate resources for reservations, and recognize the contributions of Native veterans. He saw some progress. The Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968, the Indian Self-Determination Act of 1975, gradual improvements in healthcare and education. But he also saw continued neglect, continued poverty, continued disrespect for the people who had given so much. When the Code Talker program was finally declassified in 1968, Teddy was among the first to speak publicly about his service. He became a spokesman for Native veterans, traveling across the country to share his story. But his message was not simply one of pride. It was also one of challenge. "Do not just celebrate us," he said at a speech in 1972. "Do not just give us medals and pat yourselves on the back for recognizing our service. Look at the conditions on our reservations. Look at the poverty, the unemployment, the lack of opportunity. Look at how this country treats the people whose language saved its soldiers. If you want to honor the Code Talkers, honor us with action. Honor us with justice. Honor us with the respect that should have been ours all along." Teddy Draper died in 1986. He did not live to see the Congressional Gold Medal awarded to the Code Talkers in 2001. He did not live to see the national monument dedicated to their memory. But those who knew him say that he would have had mixed feelings about these honors. He would have been proud, yes, but he would also have asked whether anything had really changed, whether Native Americans were still treated as second-class citizens in their own land, whether the lessons of the Code Talkers had truly been learned. These are questions we must still ask today. The fifth and final story we must tell tonight concerns a Code Talker whose life after the war took an unexpected turn, leading him to a form of service that he considered even more important than his military career. His name was Ki-Etsisiti, and he was deployed to the Pacific in 1944 as one of the later waves of Code Talker recruits. He served on Peleliu and Okinawa, 2 of the bloodiest battles of the war. What Ki witnessed on those islands changed him in ways he did not fully understand until years later. On Peleliu, he watched Marines die in temperatures that exceeded 115 degrees, fighting for every yard of coral rock against an enemy that refused to surrender. On Okinawa, he saw civilians throw themselves off cliffs rather than face capture, convinced by Japanese propaganda that Americans were monsters who would torture and kill them. He saw courage beyond description. He saw horror beyond imagination. He saw the best and worst of humanity compressed into months of unrelenting violence. When Ki returned home in 1945, he was not the same person who had left. The optimistic young man who had volunteered for service had been replaced by someone older, harder, haunted by memories that would not fade. Like many veterans, Ki struggled in the years immediately after the war. He drank too much. He had nightmares. He could not hold a job. His marriage failed. He drifted from place to place, searching for something he could not name. Then, in 1952, something changed. Ki was visiting his grandmother on the reservation when she asked him to help her with a traditional healing ceremony for a sick child. Ki had learned some of the old ways as a boy, but he had abandoned them during the war, dismissing them as superstition. Now, standing in his grandmother's hogan, watching her perform rituals that had been passed down for generations, Ki felt something stir inside him. It was like waking up from a long sleep, he later said, like remembering who I was before the war took that person away. Ki began studying traditional Navajo medicine. He learned the songs, the ceremonies, the plant remedies, the spiritual practices that had sustained his people for centuries. He apprenticed with medicine men who recognized in him a calling that went beyond personal healing. By 1960, Key had become a respected medicine man himself. He conducted ceremonies for veterans, for the sick, for those struggling with addiction or despair. He became known for his ability to help people find peace with their past. But Key's most important work was something that few people knew about. In the decades after the war, Key quietly collected the stories of his fellow code talkers. He recorded their experiences, their struggles, their triumphs and tragedies. He documented the program that the government kept classified, preserving the history that might otherwise have been lost. When the Code Talker program was finally declassified, Key's recordings became an invaluable resource for historians. His collection of oral histories, stored in boxes in his modest home, contained details that existed nowhere else. But Key did not collect these stories for historians. He collected them for a different reason. "I wanted to remember them," he said in an interview from 1995, "not as heroes, not as warriors, as human beings, as young men who were afraid and brave at the same time, as sons and brothers and fathers who did what their country asked, and then came home to face their demons alone. The government wanted to forget us. The history books ignored us. But I refused to let our stories disappear. I recorded everything I could. I wrote down names and dates and places. I saved photographs and letters and documents, because someday, I knew, people would want to know the truth. Someday, our grandchildren would ask what we did in the war, and I wanted to be able to give them answers." Key died in 2010 at the age of 88. His collection of Code Talker materials was donated to the Navajo Nation Museum, where they remain available for researchers and visitors. At his funeral, one of his grandsons, himself a Marine who had served in Iraq, gave a eulogy that captured the essence of Key's life. "My grandfather was a warrior twice over," the grandson said. "First, he fought the enemies of his country on battlefields across the Pacific. Then, he fought a different enemy. The enemy of forgetting, the enemy of silence, the enemy that wanted to erase his people and their contributions from history. He won both battles. He came home from the war alive, and he made sure that the story of the Code Talkers would never be forgotten. That is his legacy. Not medals or monuments. The truth, preserved, protected, passed down. These are the stories of America's Code Talkers, stories of men who turned their ancient language into an unbreakable weapon, stories of sacrifice, secrecy, and survival, stories that were hidden for decades and are only now being fully told. They were not perfect men. They struggled with the same demons that haunt all veterans. They faced challenges that most of us cannot imagine. They carried burdens that would have broken lesser souls, but they endured. They served. They helped win the most devastating war in human history, and they did it using the very language that their own government had tried to destroy. There is a lesson in their story that goes beyond military history. It is a lesson about identity, about resilience, about the power of culture to survive even the most determined attempts at erasure. The Navajo language was supposed to die. It was supposed to fade away, as assimilation policies stripped Native children of their heritage. It was supposed to become a relic of the past, studied by anthropologists and mourned by activists. Instead, it became a weapon that saved thousands of lives. It became proof that the old ways had value. It became a source of pride for generations of Navajo people who had been told their culture was worthless. The Code Talkers did not just help win a war. They helped save a language. They helped preserve a culture. They helped demonstrate that diversity is not weakness, but strength. That the differences between peoples can be bridges rather than barriers. This is a truth that our world desperately needs to remember. We live in an age of division, an age when people are told that those who are different are threatening, an age when ancient languages die every month, taking with them wisdom that can never be recovered. An age when the lessons of history are ignored by those who should know better. The code talkers remind us that there is another way. They remind us that the stranger may be the ally, that the language we do not understand may hold the key to our survival, that the people we have mistreated may be the ones who save us. This is not a comfortable lesson. It requires us to confront the injustices of our past. It requires us to acknowledge that our enemies were often of our own creation. It requires us to humble ourselves before those we have wronged and ask for the help we do not deserve. But it is a necessary lesson, because the challenges we face today are greater than any one people can solve alone. Climate change, pandemic disease, the threat of nuclear war. These are problems that require all of humanity to work together. Problems that require us to bridge our differences rather than widen them. The code talkers showed us how. They took a language of peace and made it a weapon of war. But more importantly, they took a history of oppression and turned it into a story of redemption. They showed that even the deepest wounds can heal. Even the greatest injustices can be overcome. Even the most divided peoples can find common cause. That is their true legacy. Not the code they created, not the battles they won, but the hope they represent. The hope that we can be better than our past. The hope that we can build a future where every language is valued, every culture is respected, every person is seen as a potential ally, rather than a potential enemy. As I close this story, I want to leave you with a final thought. The code talkers served a country that had mistreated their people for generations. They could have refused. They could have said that America's war was not their war. They could have pointed to broken treaties and stolen land and children torn from families and asked why they should lift a finger to help, but they did not refuse. They served. They gave everything they had to protect a country that had given them so little. Why? I asked Key Etsicity this question during our interview in 1995. His answer has stayed with me ever since. We did not fight for the government, he said. We did not fight for the flag. We did not even fight for America. Not really. We fought for our families. We fought for our land. We fought for the sacred mountains and the desert sky and the generations who would come after us. We fought because we knew that if the enemy won, everything we loved would be destroyed. And we fought because our ancestors taught us that warriors protect their people. Not just when it is easy, not just when it is fair, always, no matter the cost. That is what it means to be a warrior. That is what it means to be Navajo. That is what the code talkers understood. We are all, in our own ways, warriors. We all face battles that seem impossible. We all carry burdens that seem too heavy. We all struggle with enemies, both external and internal, that threaten to overwhelm us. The code talkers show us that these battles can be won, not through violence alone, not through force alone, but through courage, through faith, through the unshakable conviction that what we fight for is worth fighting for. And if you find yourself struggling, if you find yourself wondering whether the battle is worth it, remember this: you are not alone. There is one who fights with you. One who has already won the ultimate victory over darkness and death. One whose love is stronger than any enemy, whose grace is sufficient for any challenge, whose peace passes all understanding. His name is Jesus Christ, and he is waiting for you to call upon him. The code talkers understood this. Many of them were Christians who drew strength from their faith during the darkest days of war. They knew that their ancestors watched over them, yes, but they also knew that above all ancestors, above all spirits, there is a God who created us all, a God who loves us all, a God who sent his Son to save us all. That is the greatest code of all, the code of salvation, the code written in the blood of Christ on the cross of Calvary, the code that unlocks the door to eternal life. It cannot be broken. It will never be broken. and it is available to everyone who believes. So as you go from this place, remember the code talkers. Remember their courage. Remember their sacrifice. Remember their unshakable faith in the face of impossible odds. And remember that the same God who watched over them watches over you. The same strength that sustained them is available to you. The same victory that they achieved can be yours. All you have to do is believe. All you have to do is ask. All you have to do is surrender your life to the one who gave his life for you. May God bless you. May he keep you. May he make his face shine upon you and give you peace. And may the stories of these native warriors inspire you to be a warrior yourself, a warrior for truth, a warrior for justice, a warrior for love. The battle is not over. The enemy is still out there. But with God on our side, victory is certain. Until we meet again, go in peace. Go in faith. Go in the knowledge that you are loved by the Creator of the universe, who knew you before you were born, and who will welcome you home when your battles are finally done. Amen.